I'm Arthur Dodson, and yeah, I joined Capgemini on the 1st of March, and I joined as a software engineer on the graduate scheme, and for the last 2 months I've been on the bit of backstory. Beforehand, I was at University of Bristol and studied engineering and maths, and then did a master's in data science and AI. And then, yeah, since joining and since coronavirus has come about, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to put my skills to test, try and model coronavirus, to understand the problem, to analyze the dynamics, and then look into like how government policy is going to affect dynamics, and then why else? Just because bit of a hobby and interesting, especially when having such an impact on our life. Okay, so. Quick agenda. I'm going to start off with showing you a basic method to model an epidemic, and then we'll later try and refine that model, because hopefully we'll get quite a good overview of like just seeing roughly when sort of peaks might happen by using the sort of basic thing, and then to maybe look at the data more precisely, and when we try and line up the model with the data, it's important to make our model more accurate. And then we're going to look at how the transmission changes with governmental policy, especially in Italy, and then we'll go on to looking at the country I live in, the UK. And yeah, just a warning, if the first few slides get a bit heavy or you don't understand every little detail, don't worry, we will. It's important, but don't get bogged down by it. We can. So the basic premise to modeling an epidemic is using these compartmental models, which are essentially meant to be intuitive to understand, and we split the population up into three compartments: people who are susceptible. So people who can get the disease, and then people who are in this infected compartment, so people who sort of currently have it, and then the removed section, where people have either recovered or sadly passed away. And then we sort of look at the flow from susceptible to infected to removed. And from susceptible to infected, it sort of happens at this rate, which you've probably seen in the news quite a lot, this reproduction number, R0. And essentially what that is if for someone who has the virus, it's how many people on average will they pass it on to. So if it's sort of 3 or something, the average person will pass on the disease or the virus to 3 other people. So that's how you get from susceptible to infected, and then from infected to removed. That happens at the time it takes to recover or sadly pass away. So, for example, 20 days or whatever that might be. And so the idea is that these three compartments make up the whole population, like the whole time. So, right. So with that, we're going to try and quantize what I've just sort of said, and we do it with differential equations, or at least this model does. And so actually, wait, if I get a laser pointer. So this is just rate of change of this susceptible compartment. And again, it's fairly intuitive, because obviously people who are susceptible only get infected if they interact with an infected person. And so that's why we can see this I here. And then we see this S over N. So that's sort of like the probability of this infected person interacting with a susceptible person. And it happens at this rate beta. I mean, beta is essentially the reproduction number, but it's sort of time dependent. And so the reproduction number is sort of, so if it's 3, I'll pass on the disease to an average of 3 other people over the period I'm infected. So over 20 days, I'll pass on to 3 other people. What beta's doing is simply just saying, okay, so if that's over 20 people, what about one day? So over 20 days, what about how many people I'm going to pass on to in one day? So for example, like 3 over 20 days. So fairly simple, and you can imagine that susceptible is just going down. So yeah, and so because we're assuming that big assumption I should have touched on is that people in the removed compartment can't become susceptible again. So this is where they've either passed away or they've recovered and they're therefore immune. I mean, lots of the information, I'm definitely not an expert in coronavirus, but lots of literature that I've looked into seems to suggest that the chance of getting reinfected is very low, especially in the short term. So anyway, so susceptible is just going to go down over time, and then infected is going to sort of go up by the same number that susceptible goes down. But then it also decreases when people either get better or sadly pass away. And so that's why we see this minus gamma here times I. What's gamma? It's a bit like the beta. It's sort of just the recovery rate. So if the recovery is 20 days, for example, or 18 days, it's looking at how many people will recover per day. So it's sort of 1 over 18, for example. So this is going to go sort of up a bit and then sort of down. And then how is remove going to change? Well, we're assuming 0 at the start. And so it's just going to slowly increase until we sort of it plateaus on a peak. So anyway, don't get too bogged down by the equations. And we'll go on to trying to solve these differential equations, because this is sort of what makes the model sort of tick along. Again, don't get sort of too hung up on this. This is just the maths behind it. And essentially, these differential equations, so if we have the initial values, for example, like the number of susceptible people at the start is 60 million, and we know the infected people at the start is, say, we'll put a number on it, maybe 1,000, and the number of people in the removed section is 0. So, but actually so that's for time 0 or the first day. But what about day 2 or day t plus 1? So t plus 1 day. In the way we do it is because these are 3 differential equations, and if you remember, all they sort of represent is a gradient or a sort of slope. And by using that slope, so if we imagine this as the trajectory of this differential equation I, we know the values here, we can calculate the gradient. And the idea is that if you move a really small sort of step along that slope, then actually it'd be quite a good approximation for these values Si and R for the next time step, for a little step forward. But because I'm going to use a slightly bigger time step, I'm going to do a day time step. We are going to have to do so that what I was describing was a first order Runge-Kutta method, Euler method. Because we want something slightly more accurate for a bigger time step, a day time step, we're going to use sort of essentially just 4 gradients in different places and take an average, which these sort of represent. But again, it's not critical to understanding this presentation, so do not worry. The interesting stuff's going to come. Okay, so an initial model of the UK. So everything we've just seen, we are going to make. We're going to see how it runs over time. So the susceptible people, the number of people who are removed from the system, number of people who are infected. And remember, this is just essentially these differential equations with the solving method. And if we run it over time, we get these sort of 3 lines. And we can see a really good general picture of sort of what's happening. A fairly crude model, but you can sort of understand that the infected, the peak's going to happen in months instead of maybe years or days. You can understand sort of the numbers. You can see the incredible rate at which something happens exponentially. Like if you look at the scale here, this is millions, so this would be 15 million people infected at one time, which, I mean, pretty hard to fathom, hard for me to fathom until you sort of see the numbers. And we sort of implemented governmental policy around where the laser between March and April. And so you can sort of see how out of control everything gets. And so this is with a reproduction number of 2.4, and so which isn't seemingly very big. I mean, like one person infecting 2.5 other people on average doesn't feel very big, but actually when you start to move forward in time, things can get pretty out of control. But so this is the initial model. We're going to now try and work on refining this and making this better. Okay, so first way to do this is try to pick apart the infection compartment. And so instead of one sort of just infection compartment, we're going to break it up into 18 different ones. For example, like the dynamics of like how people progress through the virus. So, day one you're exposed. I guess to make it more clear, if you imagine someone, I don't know, Tommy, your average guy or average woman, Tometta, who gets coronavirus, then Tommy on day one, he picks it up, he doesn't know about it, he's going about his life as sort of normal, he's going to the shops, but he's got the virus, and then the viral load starts to build up, and that's the amount of virus you have in your body. And so with viral load building up, you start to shed that virus more. So Tommy, so the viral load is going to build up here on sort of day 3 after he's been infected. And then he's still going about his life as normal. He doesn't know he's got it. Not until sort of maybe day 4 or day 5, he starts to sort of, get some symptoms and sort of feels a bit bedridden, feels a bit under the weather. And so then starts to sort of isolate, maybe, by mistake, but just has, is in bed all day. So the amount he passes on that virus actually starts to decrease, even though he's a lot iller, which is interesting. So we're going to try and include this sort of data and average Tommy into our model and see how it affects it. And day 18 is when Tommy sadly dies or recovers. Okay, so what we've just said for average Tommy, we're going to try and quantize it, and essentially there's been quite a lot of work done on to try and model this infection profile. And there's resources online. You see a couple of references down here. But essentially, as I was saying, it's this infection profile is sort of built up from the viral load, how much virus I have in me, and the number of people that I sort of interact with. And what they found is that this sort of distribution follows a gamma distribution, which again, not that important, but essentially a gamma distribution has a parameter in it called alpha. And alpha essentially defines the shape of the curve. So you'll see 2 different shapes, 2 different alphas, and why am I going to do 2? Well, because there's actually, even though the shape follows some sort of gamma distribution, what sort of value for alpha, they're not too sure. There's been some people say that pre-symptomatic transmission, so the stuff before the red line, how much of the virus I'm shedding before I show symptoms, is as low as 12%. And then other papers, sort of, there's a paper from Oxford a week and a half ago, suggested it was as high as 44% of the transmission happens before they start to show symptoms. And that is very important for the dynamics of the model. So we're going to come back to this, but firstly, we are going to try and quantize that again. So because obviously my model is discrete, because this is a continuous line. What we want to do is try and put a number on it per day. What's the probability of me infecting someone on each day that I have the virus? And so you can see we can sort of bin it, so to say, and we can use the height of those bins or the probability to then adjust our reproduction rate. So you can see sort of the height here for day 2 when the viral load starts to build up, and he's interacting with lots of people as normal. It's of 0.045. So this is going to adjust our reproduction rate for this subcompartment I3. And then I4, we're going to adjust the reproduction rate because the probability of him infecting someone increases 0.19. And this is going to happen so on and so forth. For each day, we're going to adjust the reproduction rate, using this quantized gamma distribution. Okay, so now we figured out how we're going to use this use this data in our model. Let's try and give it some initial conditions, and then we're going to compare the infection profiles here again. Okay, so initial conditions. So we're going to do Italy now, because why Italy? There's more sort of, when I started this project, the side project 3 weeks ago, Italy was sort of the first country to really be hit by coronavirus in the West, and the data was good. It's all on sort of GitHub and things like that. So it's a good place to start. So 60 million people is the population of Italy. And then you can see we have all our subcompartments for I down here. And so sort of 500, going back to Tommy, 500 average Tommies on day 1, and then 200 on day 2, 100 on day 3, 80 on day 4, and so on and so forth. And then why these numbers? Why, if I just pluck these out the air? I haven't. I've tried to be fairly logical about it and assume, because we know some of the data. We know when, for example, 6 people sadly passed away in Italy on the 24th of February. So we can sort of back propagate that and say, okay, well, if 6 people died on the 24th of February, assuming a death rate of, well, it doesn't really matter just far, so 0.5%. That means 18 days before, we're assuming 1,200 people were infected, because 1,200 people pass that through 18 days, 0.5% of them then sadly pass away, and that matches up the data. So that's how we got this. So if you add up these values for I subcompartment, 1,200, and then also a quick comparison, what about 5%? Is that going to make a massive difference to your whole model? Well, actually, early on, the dynamics aren't too different, because if you assume a death rate of 5%, so on the 24th of February, 6 people passed away, 18 days before, maybe only 100, well, then we're assuming that only 120 people had the virus. So because the initial condition is a lot lower, actually, the dynamics end up being pretty similar for the start up to like the 17th of March. And then it gets a bit different. But for the start, they don't change too much. Okay, so with that, we're going to go back to comparing our infection profiles. So here, how to choose the infection profile. This is how I chose it. So if you remember, so with the gamma, so 38% pre-symptomatic transmission, this black line, and then the green line, 23% pre-symptomatic transmission. You'll see sort of the peak is lower with less pre-symptomatic transition. It's sort of slightly more spread out in higher. And then we can, if we zoom in on the data we have, so down here, this sort of red circle, and we zoom in on that, we can see that for my model, the 38% pre-symptomatic transmission seemed to fit the data much better than the green line here. So that was sort of my thinking behind. That was my thinking behind using the 38% pre-symptomatic transmission. From now on, I'm going to be using that in my model. Okay, how does the model line up with the Italian data? And not very well so far, obviously. So we can see that if the dynamics were to play out with a within our number of 3.5, then you can see that actually the peak would have happened, like a week and a half ago, and it would have been carnage, maybe up to 14,000 deaths a day. But obviously that's not the whole story, because actually the government in Italy are implementing measures. They're closing universities, they're locking down the provinces, and then nationwide lockdown, and then the restaurants and bars are closing, etc. And what's going to change is the average transmission, because obviously the average transmission depends on how many people, like the people contacts, and obviously that's going to decrease dramatically each time these measures are introduced. So let's try and change the R number in my model at each of these days to fit the data and see how everything plans out. So now we adjust the transmission rate of R0 in the Italian data model. Okay, so for example, this is where, if we just go back one, is where the schools and universities were closed, and then sort of lockdown is sort of happening here, and restaurants and bars closed, and then factories shut here. And what it might appear is that this is causing this inflection here. Actually, it isn't. If we go down to here, how much the R number is changing, is actually 0. It didn't change or change the R number very little here. It's this here which is causing this inflection. And so that's the nationwide lockdown. And so we see a drop in the R number of 75% to fit this data. And you can see that with my model, it's the R numbers actually now, even though you see quite a steep decrease, is just below 1, which is maybe is 0.9, which maybe you think, oh, because it's dropping so massively, the R number must be sort of a good way lower than 1. But from this analysis, it looks like the R number is just below 1, and that's really important because it shows that the R number has a lot of sensitivity in it. And so we will see. So with that, let's look at a couple of different scenarios. So scenario 1, okay. Imagine the government of Italy, they lift lots of their lockdown measures, still keep a good deal of them in place though. So it goes back to an R number of maybe 1.75. Remember, that's the average number of people I'll pass on the disease to, the virus to, if I've got coronavirus. So 1.5 other people doesn't sound like very much, and still half what it was according to my model beforehand. So there's still a lot of changes in place and a lot of social distancing, etc. But we still see that the dynamics managed to run out of control again. And by out of control, I mean, for example, the NHS service is overrun, and you maybe see a higher death rate than normal. And yeah, so you can see that just like a small change in the R number can have drastic changes on the gradient of the slopes, for example, and what happens. But scenario 2, what happens if we release, so scenario 2, what happens if we release only a few lockdown measures? For example, like you're allowed to sit down in the park in 2, but like no large gatherings of more than, I don't know, 3 or something. So still keeping pretty tight things. And so the R number jumps back up to 1.3. So a lot lower than it was at the start, a little bit lower than what it was here. We can see that actually everything seems to be in much more control. And again, where maybe the NHS service can stretch to can stretch to the number of patients coming in. And I find that really interesting because it shows that the R number is so sensitive even now to the dynamics in the next few months. And so shows how important, according to this model, how important governmental policy could be in the next in the next few months. And actually, what's really interesting here is, I haven't pointed out, is actually this is a very different scale to the one before. If we look, this goes from mid-May, it starts to rise again all the way to November. So really like flattening out that curve. The same sort of area under the curve as the one before, whereas this is middle of May to sort of middle of August. And you can see everything happens a lot quicker with an R number 1.75. Okay, and now we are going to go and have a look at the situation in the UK. Why the UK? I mean, I live in the UK, so thought it would be interesting to see, and you might be interested too. Same process. I'm gonna change the R number according to these sort of 4 events here. By these set differences down here, change the transmission by that much, and get the model to fit the data again. And what you can see is that the lockdown has, the lockdown seems to have a big effect. But actually, what would happen? So this is a drop of 65% here in the transmission. What happens if this lockdown happened 3 days earlier? So for example, actually the 65% drop happened here, and then maybe a 15% drop afterwards. What would be the change in dynamics? I thought it'd be quite interesting to have a look at. So is earlier lockdown, and this is my model, by no means so we can see that actually it's a very different outlook, and it shows that the sensitivity in governmental policy is huge. You can, like, this is maybe 2/3 of the amount of people that passed away from just locking down maybe 3 days earlier, and then 3 days later you can imagine it'd be a bit probably quite a lot more out of control. And I'm absolutely by no means criticising a governmental position, but it's interesting nonetheless to see how things change when you've got exponential growth. And so I find that quite interesting. And that is basically it. Why is this useful? Well, knowing the R number, which I'm sure you've sort of seen in the news lots and lots, is vital to maybe having a better understanding of what's going to happen in the future, and then releasing lockdown measures is in stages and seeing how dynamics change. But actually, also it's quite useful for vaccination. Because if you remember back to those compartments, the susceptible, infected, and removed, if you could move a chunk of those people in the susceptible compartment straight to the removed compartment, so the population is still the same, but there's way more people in the removed compartment to start with, the dynamics of the whole system are going to change dramatically. So for vaccination purposes, these models are incredibly useful. And anyway, they just give a good general overview of things which can happen. And there's lots of other uses. But any questions, fire them away. Yeah, thank you. You got any questions?
You mentioned in discussion earlier, for anybody that's interested in your sources, is Neil Ferguson's report, as well as the references that you've used in this article. I'll be sharing a recording of this session, but if I could just get those separately as well, please, I'll attach those to the email.
Absolutely, that sounds good. I'll note that down.
So Duncan has requested you to present on the news.
That's very kind. Thank you.
All right, if there's no further questions.
Claude, can I ask one?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, very, very interesting, Arthur. Very, very, very well presented. So thanks for that. I just wondered if you thought or included, and not you may already have done, anything to do with the going into that removed population, people who have had the virus but been asymptomatic, so actually haven't realised they've had it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And essentially, if we go back to the infection profile, lots in the work which was done into so maybe the true infection profile for someone which has the virus would maybe be 13% pre-symptomatic transmission. So actually, they don't pass it on a lot before they show symptoms. But actually, because I've tried to fit the model to the data, I'm seeing an infection or 38% pre-symptomatic transmission, which may not be sort of the true case, but essentially that could be accounting for those asymptomatic cases, and lots of work done into creating these distributions of the infection profile goes into things called the serial interval, which is looking at the symptom onsets of successive cases. And with that, the symptom onsets successive cases, with that, it's going to to some extent, it's going to inherently include asymptomatic cases within that model, because if there's lots more people who have the virus than you think, and you get symptoms in only a few of them, you can, if you measure the time between each symptom onset, it is slightly, it should account for some of the asymptomatic cases. But onto asymptomatic cases, I would also been thinking, and I'd love to try and include a sort of separate compartment line in my model. So instead of having susceptible to infected, I'd then have like two layers in the infected, which would be one asymptomatic layer and then one symptomatic layer. And then maybe I'll get a more accurate model. But yeah, asymptomatic, definitely.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I see. Yeah, so that percentage would be lower if there was nobody that was asymptomatic. If everyone showed symptoms, they would sort of self-isolate because they'd be feeling ill sooner,
exactly.
And therefore that would reduce.
Much better than me.
No, anyway, lovely, thank you.
Yeah, Arthur. Sorry. In your study, you take each individual as being an individual. Have you looked at splitting the population by different characteristics, such as age, and whether that would have a difference between the Italian data set and the UK data set? Because the Italian population profile is more biased towards old, and the UK is more biased towards slightly younger, and other less mature states obviously have younger populations. Equally, I know the government are starting to look at backgrounds of people and the different the different incidents of people's backgrounds on their likelihood to be affected.
Exactly. So I guess there's a couple of questions there. Age, I think age will essentially play into, if you imagine the chances of everyone getting infected is pretty similar, which again, like, I'm not an expert in coronavirus, but I think that might be, it's not a bad assumption. Then the age is going to affect the death rate, which is going to affect the death rate, which is changing over time, and is instead of timesing the removed number by sort of 5%, it actually be a variable number, especially over time. As more people sadly pass away, then I guess the death rate will start to decrease. So yeah, I mean, the death rate's a big thing, and I know I've done some research into trying to figure that out more precisely, but yeah, for the general dynamics of the model and the R numbers, it wouldn't affect it too much. But yeah, and then also about I guess would you say you're referring to like different clusters of people to some extent? So, for example, like London's like quite a densely populated cluster, and then like the West Country isn't so much. Yeah, so that's actually quite difficult to model. You'd probably want to be a more precise model than what I've done. You do it by modeling the population as like a network, and sort of trying to account for all the clusters individually, and like trying to essentially a much more precise model of the population. And then you would maybe start off in London, and you would sort of see the dynamics across the network, and you could sort of model it like that. But they're good. People don't have brilliant results with quite often the network ones are hard to do well. I know that, and they're big computational power and things like that. So but yeah, those factors definitely affect things. But for general outlooks and general overviews, I don't think this one I've done.
I'll just say thank you. It was very fascinating. Sorry that it was a challenging question, but thank you. It was a very good presentation.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, this is James. The population density rates obviously is an interesting one, and particularly when you're looking at releasing lockdown restrictions. Rather than looking at locations, population density rates, people per square meter, if you like, would be a critical element in determining release of lockdown, because obviously the population density increases the rate at which you may infect other people.
Yeah, for sure. Different states have different parts of the country have vastly different circumstances, so that's going to affect transmission massively. And yeah, I guess that comes into the government devolving power to some extent, but yeah, and then it plays into that whole model this as a network instead of a dynamic system, or no, instead of a deterministic system. And it's difficult to do that stuff. And what you could do is do some correlations between densely populated places or densely populated states and see sort of how the data lines are. I did a bit of that with Italy, and to be honest, I didn't actually find I didn't really find that much correlation between, which is really interesting. I don't really know why, but yeah, there's a big part.
I'm not sure we'd be expecting you to build that model, but I'm sure there's plenty of government boss to do it, isn't there?
Yeah, I hope so.
Good, thanks.
Hi, Arthur. Two quick questions so I can understand the model a bit better.
Yeah.
That's okay. The first one is it accurate to say that a lot of these like population density and the behavior of people is baked into the R number in the period?
So you broke up a bit there. Can you please say it again?
Yes. Is it accurate to say that things like population density and how people are interacting, how people are obeying the lockdown age, all of this is baked into the R0 number?
Yeah, so the R0 is a massive generalization for for everything which affects transmission, essentially. And so to obviously include all the variables which make up R naught is pretty much impossible to do it accurately. So I think, yeah, so a good way, and what I think is a good way to do it is to see how, like, well, my model matches up with the data. So obviously when I've changed the R naught by like so much or X amount, that then seems to follow the true sort of trajectory. So the R naught sort of includes everything which is transmission. That's
great. And the other one is something I didn't understand about the pre-symptomatic transmission. If we go back to that plot for 1 second.
Here?
Or 1 second. The one with the scribbled out area. Yeah, this one. Yes, perfect. My question is that the probability of transmitting the disease before showing symptoms, or the percentage of people who transmit the disease before showing symptoms? One way to ask the question.
I didn't explain it very well. It's the probability, exactly. So this is a probability density function, and it's the probability that sort of the average person will infect someone. So and then you can quantize it in sort of days. So the probability I'll infect someone on day 2 is sort of 0.149, and then you can times that by the average transmission rate. So exactly, in answer to your question, it's probability of infecting someone.
So the part I don't understand is if everyone as soon as they show symptoms isolated fully, so they never transmit the disease after symptoms, will we see that probability remain at 23% or go to 100%?
Exactly. So I guess it goes to 100%. So if they got symptoms and then literally did not see a single other person, didn't transmit the disease to anyone, you would see 100% pre-symptomatic transmission, because the only way it could pass on is before people have shown symptoms. So yes.
Okay. So and that my understanding is that this number will change a lot depending on how much people respect the situation.
And also respect themselves, and also like asymptomatic, that's a big thing. So people don't even know, but they're shedding the virus, and so even if everyone sort of keeps the rules or sort of isolates when they get symptoms, like obviously some people won't get symptoms, so it's a slightly different story. But
great, thank you, that makes a lot of sense.
Pleasure.
Arthur, I've got one question, if I may. I don't know, are you able to say when the death rate might reach 100 a day given the current R number? If we kept the same kind of profile and nothing else was done, when would you actually get down to perhaps a more manageable state, shall we say, when the NHS could get back to normal?
So if we just kept this trajectory, I guess really crude, like I haven't, but crudely it would follow this sort of dynamic where my laser is sort of like that. I could have ran it for that number to stay with, and it would have been sort of around sort of July on that trajectory. I don't have a picture for you right now, and I don't have a date for you, but sort of
you can just extrapolate that out. That's interesting. Thanks.
All right, we just out of time. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Arthur. It's very interesting. Just to recap, we will be sharing this with some of Arthur's links to the data in an email shortly. So thanks everybody. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you on the next Lunch and Learn in 2 weeks' time.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.